again for being late. But we are so privileged to have with us this evening Susan Crawford, author of the book Fiber. And I know that Senator Bennett has his copy. That's why I brought my 2 copies, just so I could show him up. We're all avid readers. Everyone that has read the book Fiber is a huge fan of Susan's. And it couldn't be a better time for us to be hearing from her about some of her insights, her success stories from her work around the country. And the part of the reason for that is that it will, of course, inform our work over the next few weeks that's going on as we speak in my committee and other committees. And we want to dive right in. We don't want to leave any stone unturned here in terms of our time with Susan. Very fortunate to have her here tonight. And also, by the way, I don't want to forget it, coming in the fall as the keynote speaker for a much bigger conference. So this is really a 1-2 and the beginning of the conversation. So really privileged to have Susan Crawford with us. And I'm going to turn it over. I don't have the agenda in front of me, but I think it may have been to go briefly to Tracy and Japheth, if Japheth is here. Just quickly, if you are new to the caucus, put your name in the chat, please. Tell us why you're here, what your questions are. As we hear from Susan, as always, we'll be able to put our questions in the chat, and we'll have time for Q&A after she speaks. But welcome to what may be our final and our I think arguably best broadband caucus of this legislative session. Tracy, what else? What have I missed? Or Jay? Tracy, you're muted.
Yeah, maybe I should unmute. I don't want to take any more time away from Susan than necessary, so I'm just going to remind everybody to check out the Caucus Corner on the main Broadband Coalition website. Everything you need to know is there, and if you have any questions, contact me or Japheth. That's it.
Great. I think the next thing on the agenda is that just a very quick touch on things that are being legislated. There's a bunch of bills in the Energy, Utilities, and Technology Committee, and far be it from me to explain what their status is, because as we all know, the legislative session is coming to a rapid close, and that committee's House Chair is here. Has got a very full plate, a lot of bills still left to deal with, and many of them dealing with broadband. The LD 1484, which is the bill that I'm the lead sponsor on, which is supported by the coalition, the main connectivity authority bill, is still in gestation. It's being redrafted now, live time, and actually speaking with Commissioner Johnson later this evening about it. We've got LD 1432, which is a municipal gigabit fund bill that Representative Berry has, and LD 1219, which is Representative Toole's bill on pole attachments, both very much live too. So all these things are going to come to a head in the next week to 10 days. And there are many other bills too that need to get sorted out in this space. And it's a critical time, and we'll just try to keep you all informed with developments real time as they happen out of EUT. And so even though we may not be meeting as a caucus, we'll let you all know where things are and how they're developing. So any quick questions or any bills that anybody wanted to touch on real fast before we move into the main event?
Rick, I'll give a very quick plug that the Broadband Coalition has a blog that posted last week, just a quick status report on some of the priorities that we've talked about in this caucus. And so if folks haven't had a chance, I'll share a link, but it is a good, the sentiment is we've been gaining traction and we need to remain vigilant. But I'll share that link, otherwise hand to you, Seth.
Yeah, just before you do that, I just also wanted to, not everybody may know this, but the the broadband bond bill that I was sponsoring is very much alive too, but has been voted to carry over to the $100 million bond would be carried over into the next regular session of the legislature because we're receiving all the federal funds. So I just want to let you all know what that was. It's still alive, but won't be taken up this year. And with that, Seth.
Well, it's very hard to introduce Susan, and I think you know, the best way is really to just hand it right over to her. But just briefly, she is the John Riley Clinical Professor at Harvard Law. She's an author even before the book Fiber. Fiber is the only book that I know, but it was sent to me by a former member of the Connect Maine board, Sue Woods, and the note that I still have is, I've purchased 25 copies and you get number 1 and 2. Can you identify who should get the other 23? She bought them in hardcover, by the way. Would like to target influencers as well as those we need to influence. And she wraps it up. I'm ready to get radical on this issue. So obviously Sue Woods was a convert and sent the book to me. I've been sharing it around and encouraging others to read it. And it's the kind of book that you can read again and again. There are wonderful little vignettes, incredible success stories, as well as cautionary tales. And I've just been enjoying it like a fine wine ever since. And it only gets better with age. So Susan, again, thanks for joining us. I think what your observations will be very instructive as we talk about the bills that we will be voting on over the next 2 weeks. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Seth. And it's a joy to be here with all of you because right now you really do have a once in a lifetime chance to make a bunch of thoughtful decisions and investments in telecommunications, public works, basic telecommunications infrastructure that will unleash the power of the private marketplace, lower costs for every other element of Maine's economy, help Maine lower its energy use, I'm going to talk about that too, and secure a secure future for your children and grandchildren. It's an extraordinary time, quite an opportunity, and I couldn't be happier to be speaking to all of you. I never thought of the book as being like fine wine, and you've really made my day. First, I want to talk to you about what's possible. We know it's possible because it already exists in other parts of the world. There's a country that has about the same population density as Maine. It has 63 people per square mile to Maine's 41, where every little hamlet and village, or most of them, hundreds of them, and the big city have put down the telecom equivalent of a public sidewalk. They have passive, in the book I call it dark fiber, that's what the industry calls it. Those cables are available for rent from the government at reasonable and non-discriminatory costs. The government very carefully doesn't sell internet access. It just makes it inexpensive for a vibrant, highly competitive private marketplace to sell internet access. And today, an update on the book, it's not just internet access, it's all kinds of special telemedicine, distance education, smart grid, 5G services depending on fiber, all of these things depending on instantaneous, symmetric, cheap connectivity. They're all flourishing there because the private marketplace is competing. They've got multi-gigabit service available in this country for $25 a month or less, and there's at least one actor selling 10 gigabit symmetric service, so equal uploads and downloads for about $5 a month. The basic sidewalk, that dark fiber, long ago paid for itself in a host of ways. Their lease revenue is steady and growing, their economic growth is solid, and every policy that country cares about depends on reliable world-class communications. That basic public infrastructure, it's like a sidewalk in that it can never be bought by a private equity firm or a bunch of New Yorkers and squeezed to serve individual investment profiles or business models. It's there to serve public values. And not only that, update on the book, it turns out that at every stage of its life cycle, fiber is more energy efficient than other telecom technologies. It takes less energy to run a point-to-point fiber network than a cable network because, as the book explains, you don't need a lot of active gear in the middle of a network. And the EU is finding that if they switched overnight their whole telecom infrastructure to fiber, power consumption and greenhouse gas emissions associated with telecom would go down by 80 to 90%. So big potential savings on greenhouse gas emissions. And not only that, another update, this country is becoming a top-tier place for data centers. Because connectivity is so seamless and there are no delays, everything, all those specialized services, health and everything else, can be done in the cloud reliably. And now that country is taking the substantial amount of heat generated by those data centers, having that heat moved away from the servers in the form of water inside coils, and then using that heat to warm schools and apartments and municipal buildings. So how about that? A lot possible in connection with energy connected to this incredible fiber facility. So imagine in Maine, cost-effective healthcare wherever you are, no matter how rural the area. That would be particularly good for disabled and elderly people. Imagine people working where they live. And another update on the book that I wasn't thinking of when I wrote it is that people are going to be moving to Maine in ever-increasing numbers as the climate warms. And imagine young people staying in Maine instead of leaving. Imagine reliable, persistent, cheap, future-proof internet access for everyone that will be less energy intensive to manufacture, to put it in. You just put it in once, less energy to deliver gigabits than cable, making electric AVs possible, which will also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Smart buildings. Right now we know that buildings represent 39% of global CO2 emissions. E-health, smart waste handling, smart streetlights, speeding public transit, and all of this serving a greener future. Now, those of you who read the book are probably guessing that the country is Sweden, and you are right, and we are not Sweden, and we never will be, but they're very business-like people. They love the capitalist system. And this model is so sensible that dozens of cities in the US are doing the same thing. And the big question for your state and for the country is, why aren't we treating internet infrastructure, the public works part of it, the conduit and the passive fiber, like a sidewalk or a highway? So that's the aspiration. That's what we should be heading towards as much as possible. And that's my first big point for you today. My second point is that COVID gives us a huge opportunity, a tremendous chance to make genuine progress right now. And you know this. I can hear from all the bills that are marching along, the things you're thinking about, that you're seizing the opportunity. As the book describes, alone among developed nations, we've always depended on private providers to sell us communication services, but we used to burden them with a raft of public obligations, like providing world-class service at reasonable prices. We removed all that, and the result after deregulation is that Americans are being charged an enormous amount. Providers very sensibly have consolidated and divided up markets. These are not evil companies. They're great American companies, but they've left a lot of people behind, as you in Maine know so well. And we've known ever since 2004 that we made a mistake. We're systematically underserved and overcharged as a country. And COVID has revealed to everybody the extraordinary unfairness of access. You remember the picture of those kids in front of the Taco Bell trying to do their homework. It was heart-wrenching. And we, all of a sudden, the whole country focused on the fact that people couldn't safely ensure that their kids were educated, their health was tended to, because access was just simply too expensive, because we don't have a competitive marketplace here. And the numbers we've seen are stunning. We suddenly noticed that 30% of households in San Francisco couldn't educate their kids online. And the numbers on tribal lands are horrifying, 80% plus, 40% in Baltimore, and lots of people in Maine. Having a sufficient connection at home, we know, is really tightly correlated with socioeconomic status because it's so expensive here. And COVID has shown a bright light on all of this. Fiber connections are necessary, but not sufficient, but necessary for every policy we care about, from climate adaptation to healthcare to education. And high-speed access, and I see you working towards a definition of 100 megabits symmetrical in Maine. I think that's great. That makes sense. Where that service is available in the United States, it's very expensive and it's usually offered by one actor. So we have the worst of both worlds, neither oversight nor competition. And if we don't do anything with this COVID opportunity, this sense of shared crisis, in the end, we'll end up in Maine, as in the rest of the country, with 60-70% of the market, particularly metro areas, served by a single local monopoly cable operator. The rest by some leftover telco claiming to provide fixed wireless. And let me talk to you about fixed wireless and satellite for a second. In my work in the Obama administration, we saw a lot of fixed wireless get funded, and very often fixed wireless doesn't live up to its claims in rural areas. It fails to actually serve about 20 to 30% of the population it claims it will. Trees, weather, wind, water, everything gets in the way. It's often unstable and expensive, usually a monopoly provider. So fixed wireless shouldn't be considered good enough for the people of Maine. And the same, in my opinion, goes for Starlink. These low Earth orbit satellites are a huge improvement on the traditional geostationary satellites because they were so far up, 22,000 miles up, and the latency was extraordinary. Now, the downside of the low Earth orbit satellites is that for the big old ones, you could just point up to a single point in the sky, and the geostationary satellite would be going at the same rate the Earth was, so you didn't have to move your satellite dish. You could just stay where you were and keep getting connectivity, albeit expensive and insufficient. With low Earth orbit systems, they're zipping across the sky to keep up with the Earth, and they'll enter and leave your space very quickly. And Starlink's solution to this line of sight issue is to put a lot more satellites into space. People who are using Starlink are seeing that the signal drops a lot, that it can be quite unstable out of the mere suggestion of trees make the signal nervous. And this solution of putting a lot more satellites into space isn't necessarily great. Scientists are really upset about this because of the space junk that Starlink creates. So for both fixed wireless and satellite, that's really not good enough for Maine, and we really shouldn't waste this good crisis. The fix here is to really build around these existing structures in a new way with open access, fiber conduit controlled and regulated by government. That's the opportunity now. That's how you should be spending money. And the older operators will be able to use this open access sidewalk-like infrastructure too. It will save them money as well. In addition to publicly funded public works infrastructure, as you're thinking about energy, you should let electric utilities, investor-owned utilities, munis, cooperatives, lease their dark fiber for high-speed internet access too. As long as they themselves aren't selling internet access, it's a great use of their infrastructure for this purpose. That's the long-term sensible direction. This is the root canal of policy. It takes time and effort, and you need to do whatever you can to work together to lower the cost of connectivity to everybody. Part of this, and I have a feeling you're thinking about this already, we need to make sure that there are state grants or loan support for planning in advance so that everybody's looking at their region, at the people they can work with, and has the money to do that looking around, and thinking about approaching multiple funding sources, thinking about all the services that any single piece of infrastructure needs to serve, government, healthcare, education, environment. You'll get a much bigger bang for your dollar if there's this advanced planning that's funded beforehand. And with this planning at every point, you're talking about poles, middle mile networks, last mile, wireless interconnection. At every point, you need to avoid creating choke points that are controlled by private actors. So regions should get together to ensure that publicly overseen dark fiber middle mile network connections are available at low cost. And they have frequent interconnection points that are non-discriminatory. Updated on the book, Estonia has done this in the middle mile and dug itself out of irrelevance in a matter of a few years into a shining global digital leadership role. Because if you fail to get the middle mile right, it won't matter how great the last mile publicly controlled network infrastructure is. The middle mile will choke off inexpensive communication. And I want to point you to 15 cities in the South Bay, south of Los Angeles, who got together to build a fiber ring to lower all of their costs. Nobody does this alone. Everybody has to cooperate. This is a business characterized by very high upfront costs that get lower per unit at greater scales. So the more actors you get involved in the middle mile and the last mile, the lower everyone's cost will be. So that's my second point. Don't waste the crisis and cooperate. My third point, pretty simply, is to avoid pitfalls. We know them now. I list some of them in the book. I have just 3 to highlight for you today. Don't let private actors take the lead. They're not malicious, but their incentives are not aligned necessarily with public values. And it's not their fault. Their investors will require that they systematically cherry pick markets and modalities to drive profits up, leave markets behind that don't match their Wall Street investment profiles, and control, by consolidation, entire markets if they possibly can. These are great American ideals and great American companies, but they don't fit the public's need for publicly overseen sidewalks, this analogy I'm trying to give you, that unleash the private marketplace. So that's my first pitfall. Don't do that. Also, don't treat infrastructure as a quick revenue generator for government. We don't expect sidewalks to quickly make money. We do expect them to be cost effective. And these middle mile networks that I hope you will be funding shortly will be cost effective. They will pay off modestly, persistently, until the sun explodes. They'll go on forever, but you need patience and patient capital to make them work out. And speaking of patience, another pitfall, don't go for the shiny new second best thing. The fixed wireless, the low Earth orbit satellites. Take the long-term view. Mainers deserve world-class wired networks, and that will make possible the mobile services that you need. No great wired infrastructure, no great mobile services. It may take longer, but it's worthwhile. So I'm not saying, in conclusion, that publicly owned and controlled middle mile or last mile fiber is some mystical panacea that will fix every issue that Maine is facing. There are a lot of policies to work on, and I'm not going to suggest that every little hamlet has the financial and technical skills or resources to pull off a successful business plan. But working together, you can accomplish a tremendous amount, region by region, across the state. I know Maine has that frontier, go it alone, little individual businesses are a great mentality, but that really doesn't fit infrastructure, which requires collective action. So that's what I've got to say. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I do think Maine deserves better than it's got, and I really appreciate your listening to me.
Sorry about that, I was muted. Thank you so much. That was amazing. And this is a great time to ask a question. Andrew I think his connection is bad, and Rick and I can kind of tag team on facilitating questions. Are there questions for Susan Crawford? Rick?
I have a question, yes. Thank you again, Susan, for that magnificent, inspiring message. And as you may have picked up, and as I think you know, we're looking at a brand new, shiny state independent agency called the Maine Connectivity Authority right now, and it's being negotiated between the legislature and the executive branch. We already have this entity called the Connect Maine Authority, which is really good about advising people and municipalities and other areas to and giving smallish grants out to facilitate. But the idea behind this bigger entity is to do exactly what you described, which is to be more muscular, to be more strategic in looking at the entire state of Maine and making sure that every nook and cranny of our very rural state has a solution, and in order to make sure that our frankly, our rural towns don't die, which is really, it's really existential. So I just want your advice, because we're in the middle right now of finalizing this quasi-independent agency. Do you have any advice for us about things to make sure that agency is able to do, make sure it fulfills the goals of universal, affordable, future-oriented broadband that you laid out? How should it be started? How should we capitalize? And what any advice at all would be very timely.
Well, I understand somebody told me that you'd arranged for some capitalization already. Yeah. 150 million, I think, was the number I heard. And that's substantial. I think what's really crucial for that authority is its leadership. I find over and over again that no matter what the title is, and no matter how much money is there, you need people who perhaps have left the telecom industry and understand all the shenanigans, frankly, that the industry can get into to interfere with the strategy of the authority. It needs to not be subject to the crosswinds of politics. It needs to be so embedded that it will always have the ability to march forward no matter who is governor. And so leadership really matters, and having wily staff who have seen it all and are not fazed by anything is also essential. And I used to think that, the network design, this advanced planning stuff really mattered. And as the years go by, I care more and more about leadership because without that, you could produce reports and nothing will happen. So I hope you find the right people for it. And I hope they are perhaps older, I don't want to be ageist, but people who understand that this is a very physical undertaking, and you really got to know the polls, and you've got to know the ins and outs. As far as capitalization goes, this building middle mile networks, which is what I'm understanding you're doing, I would take Estonia as a very good model. Their plan enables them to reach within half a mile of every location in the country. So sometimes we think of middle mile as being a little distant, sort of off between cities, but middle mile should go pretty deep and should have interconnection points at most neighborhoods and hamlets that are low price. Boy, we've seen a lot of failures in middle mile networks where they've been priced too high, where it actually doesn't make sense for the last mile people to be able to connect. There's no advantage to it. And where they have rules on interconnection that foil collaboration with last mile network operators. So all of that needs to be worked out. Leadership, geographic spread, long-term vision. There should be a 20-year plan for this authority that is, the best plan you can come up with, that is executed on no matter who's in office. And there should be a source of revenue that is general, that you're not at the whim of a legislature, that somehow there's an ongoing, perhaps an assessment on existing high-speed internet access connections that will ensure that that revenue doesn't go away. And it needs to be not seen itself, I tried to say this in my remarks, as a revenue generator for the state. And that's hard to resist because once the legislature sees that there's something being built, they'll want it to quickly make back money for the state. And we have seen that results in monopoly-like behavior by the authority, which begins to see itself as a moneymaker rather than a sidewalk. So having that mindset of this is a public work is really essential. Is that helpful?
Yes, very, very much, and focusing too. So thank you.
Yeah.
Senator Bennett, I hope that gives you enough to work with as you amend your bill to present to my committee, day after tomorrow, I'm thinking. Good luck with that.
Thank you so much.
It's an excellent bill, and I think he's covered a lot of those bases, but it'll be really good to go back and double check now and make, a lot of food for thought there. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm thinking particularly of Massachusetts 123, which suffered from a lot of these problems and is not a good example of a middle mile network. And it really should be helping Western Mass more than it is. So just don't do what they did and do something more like what Estonia did, and you'll be in better shape.
That is a great segue to the next question, because I think Representative Geer has a question regarding Estonia. Tracy, do you want to try to ask it yourself, or are you having technical?
No, sure, that's fine. For some reason, the Q&A function wasn't working for me. So.
Got it. Okay.
Sure. Yeah. And actually, thank you, Susan, for this great presentation. Really, really helpful. I am really curious about the Estonia analog, because there does seem to be, to me, from what I know of Estonia, some very similar cultural similarities as well as size similarities, and sort of their sort of feel is very Maine-like to me. And I'm curious, how exactly did they go about cracking their bottleneck problems that you described?
Well, they had such a crisis. They emerged from the fall of the Soviet Union, right? And with really nothing. And they have to act. And they decided that it would require government intervention and focus on a big target, which was to be a digital leader in Europe. So again, this was leadership and political decision, very deliberately taken. And And they also had more of a green field in a sense. One of America's problems is that there's a little bit of internet access here. And so we're sort of content with it, and people don't get agitated about wanting it to be better. Estonia, not there in the mid-90s. They really didn't have anything. And so they decided to leap over copper technology and go right to fiber. So that's a difference that in America we've had this weird plateau of the local cable monopolies where we've really gotten stuck, particularly in cities. And Estonia didn't have that, so that's a difference. But I think you're right, there's some great similarities, very entrepreneurial culture, very sensible concern for making government more accessible. That was a big focus of their planning. They've got a lot of e-voting, e-legislatures, e-everything happening. It was a pretty small country, so that did help them to make that plan. But once they started having successes as a digital country, lots of companies came and they got a lot of buzz, a lot of stories, and I think that gave them courage to continue. They didn't face in Estonia the extraordinary political shenanigans that we face here. FDR was attacked in the 30s for being a Bolshevik, for even talking about public involvement in electricity. And the same thing comes up today for local governments and state governments talking about government intervention in the telecommunications market. It's branded as socialist, which is just weird. So we face that in this country, and Estonia didn't have that.
Thanks.
We have a question from Lauren Arford, which, oops, it's just disappeared on me. It was about the nodes, the middle mile nodes. And I think the question was, how often, how frequently spaced? I'm not sure.
Well, it depends. It probably depends. It depends. It should be often enough that any clump of humanity should be able to access it at not too much cost. So it's just a question of what's so great about these issues is that it really just is a question of cost and planning. How many internet connection points do you want to be able to provide to the citizens of Maine? And there are engineers and experts who can help you do that. But the main point, and the thing I've really run into over and over again, is to make sure that those interconnection points aren't themselves locations for operatic game playing. You'd think that polls are boring, and polls are like, oh my God, blood and guts, people just fighting over controlling access to them, and interconnection points can get to be that way too, unless they're set up, and authority is a great way to do this, in a way that is truly non-discriminatory and available at a fair cost and a low cost, so that it is worthwhile, fits a business case for a last mile provider to come in there.
Great. Senator Stacey Brenner has a question.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Susan, for being here. I'm a listener, so I haven't read your book, but I've listened to it, and it was enjoyable. I have a question for you about if you could speak a little bit to your thoughts on government's role in digital equity and digital inclusion.
Mm-hmm. Well, a few points here. One is that this overall role I've described of making sure that a great world-class connection is available to everybody at a low cost is the first big step, and it goes a long way towards equity to make sure that for what we used to pay for phone, $20 a month, something like that, should be what you are paying for a completely reliable and essentially endless digital connection. That should be what it costs if we get these structural points right. Even that, though, is too expensive for a lot of people of color in America. And people like the new immigrants we hope will be arriving in Maine to keep the economy going, they may not be able to afford $20 or $30 a month either. So the state's role there is to subsidize connections for very low income people. I spent a lot of time in Wilson, North Carolina, that built a fiber network. In public housing there in Wilson, you can, for $10 a month, get this world-class persistent fiber connection. And the city just decided that was essential. That's what they needed to do. And that's their digital equity and inclusion way. But it's not just the connection, especially for communities of color. It's often, in addition, the device and the training, literacy and understanding, sort of hand-holding about the importance and relevance of this connection to their lives. All too often, policymakers in particular will assume that people of color relying on smartphones, that's enough, that's plenty, they've got all they need. And that is so patronizing and so unfair, because if you can afford it, anybody will want to have this great home wired connection with Wi-Fi in addition to their smartphone. And here's why. People use 40x or more the data on their home connections than they do on a smartphone. We use a smartphone to do things like check on Facebook statuses and see what Twitter's up to. But for doing your homework or going to the doctor or attending a class, if you try to use a smartphone for that, you'll run into data caps and overages, and it quickly gets extremely expensive. But helping disabled people, people of color, older people, people for whom English is a second language, helping them with training for digital skills in a non-condescending way and getting them devices and education remains a really important part of the inclusion narrative for America. A lot of this is generational, and by the way, older people are adopting internet access at higher rates than any other demographic because they want to be able to see pictures of their grandkids and communicate. And as more digital natives get older, this will be less of a problem, but it continues to be, we still need help on the relevance of great connection to your life, and how to use it, how to get access to an email, how to help your child understand what the teacher's just done. There's a lot more that can be done with that. And the nodes, speaking of network nodes, the way to do that is really through community centers and churches that are well funded and staffed to help people without being distant from them, really be part of the community to make this part of everybody's thriving life. It is possible. There are a lot of great models across the country for digital equity and inclusion. The first step is the wires, the connection at a really low price and maybe for free. But then there's also devices, there's also training, and there's also relevance and weaving it into everybody's life.
Fantastic. Susan, the next question is from one of our attendees tonight, who I believe is the Chief Operating Officer at GWI, one of our fantastic Maine-based ISPs. Mm-hmm. It's from Kerem Durag, and he says, Susan, thank you for all your perspective. That's a big question. What are the best practices of empowering, educating, and coalescing community/society to make good decisions when faced with an issue that has so many dimensions: financial, political, technical, and societal?
Well, thank you for the question. I think that it's happened. It's happening. The whole country is focused on exactly what your caucus is looking at. Everybody understands its relevance. It is not going to slip off the radar screen again. And, yes, it looks complicated, but actually it's just physical infrastructure. It's, like building a bridge, except these are pipes and wires, and there's some technology involved. But left to its own devices, the private marketplace is not going to do this for us. And that's the shift that we have to help people understand, that we don't hate American companies. We love them. They're great. But their investors will always want this to be a monopoly service that's very expensive and everything else I mentioned. So the mind shift is to take all this COVID-driven energy. My God, this is essential. How could we live without it? It's like not having clean water. It's like child abuse. It's just so unfair what we've done to so many Americans. Take all that energy and add to it appreciation for the government's role in basic infrastructure, not selling internet access, but just making the sidewalk that people can ride on and ride their bikes on and do whatever they want to on. But without the sidewalk, there's no functioning city. Maybe that's hard for people in rural areas to understand, so you just go down to roads. We need a road network. We wouldn't expect each homeowner to have to build a road for himself or herself. We expect this to be done by government. We expect this to be a part of what it takes to have a thriving life, to have a street network. Okay, same thing here. Government isn't going to be controlling speech. We don't want that. Isn't going to be using this for surveillance. Don't want that. What we want is the public work, lowering the cost of this expensive service for every other actor along the line. And by the way, helping with climate change and health. Health is one of the most interesting arguments for all of this. So I think we've got the energy, just to summarize. I think the only shift that has to happen is the understanding that there are two layers to this, the wholesale passive infrastructure public works layer, and then the swirl of private services that use it. And if we can explain this really simply to a generation that wasn't around when the Hoover Dam was built or the Bonneville Dam, these great public works that changed everybody's lives, TVA, nobody has that perspective now. So we have to use something like roads in order to get it across. But with those word pictures, the most conservative areas light up. They really get this. Like, oh yeah, this is not a partisan issue. This is just, how do I run my business at a reasonable cost? And right now, everybody in the country, except for like 4 or 5 companies, are paying rent for unbelievably expensive second-rate connections. That makes no sense, either to the GOP or to Democrats. So we need a shift in that mindset. But otherwise, as to the big question, I think we're almost there. We're making progress. I'm sorry that it took a global cataclysm to get us there, but we're all living online, and what's great is that it's working. I'm sorry that some of your connectivity isn't good enough, but we are seeing that people understand how central this is now.
Amen. It's we have quite a moment, don't we?
Yeah.
So Andrew Butcher, who is with the Maine Broadband Coalition, who made tonight possible, has a question, I believe. I'm going to go to Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Seth, and sorry, friends, that I can't have any video right now. From my quiet little hamlet here on the Portland Peninsula, our internet connection is quite unstable, it appears.
Yeah.
Figure.
But Susan, one of the things that you say time and time again in your book is that every place that seems to be fulfilling their hopes and dreams from an economic and from a vitality standpoint has ubiquitous, low-cost fiber connectivity. And you say it time and time again that you won't achieve your hopes and dreams by having fiber alone, but you certainly won't achieve it if you don't have ubiquitous, low-cost connectivity. Affordable connectivity. And so I guess you touched upon it in a couple different ways, but I'm also curious from your standpoint, what are the other ingredients that you see present in the places where they both prioritize ubiquitous, affordable connectivity and are able to capitalize on the other aspects of their hopes and dreams? You touched upon it a little bit, but I'm just curious if you can distill other trends that you feel like you see enabling the hopes and dreams of the places that are successful.
Well, I actually think that the U.S. is going to do the best at this. So first I'll point to 2 places that have the networks, but not the scrappy spirit that Americans have. So in both South Korea and Sweden, they've got fantastic connectivity, and they're making huge advances, particularly Sweden, on the energy point and these data centers that have the energy circulating back into schools. How great is that? But they're a placid people, more so than we are, and they want to import grit. They want to get some of our entrepreneurial can-do grit into the whole thing. And so I think that places in America where we're seeing both the connectivity and so that was Sweden. Same for South Korea, where if you develop anything new, some new startup business, Samsung will just buy it, and these huge conglomerates control a lot of industry. I have great hopes for the places in America that will have the great networks, but also the entrepreneurial spirit not present in Sweden, and the idea of not having everything bought up by a conglomerate that is present in South Korea. And so far, some of the big success stories along these lines, Chattanooga's brought up all the time, and I think actually they have been quite successful in turning their city around. It wasn't the network alone. It was a lot of other steps by city leaders. But what made it possible was this sense of a collective. We're all in this together. We're going to plan for our city's future. We're going to renovate downtown. Okay, here's a great fiber network. Let's bring in big and small businesses. They are still suffering from huge racial equity segregation problems. And the network isn't fixing that. They've got to figure out a way to make public transit better so that people can actually get to jobs who can't afford cars. They've got to fix their public education system. But they have seen a real resurgence of business activity in Chattanooga that can be tied to the presence of this fantastic network and its availability at a relatively low cost. They're constantly threatened by litigation, and they have a state law in place that doesn't allow them to do what Wilson is doing, to provide $10 a month connectivity to lower income people, because the state legislation doesn't requires that they, with each subscription that they sell, recoup all of their costs associated with that. So anyway, it's a complicated situation in Tennessee because of the legislature there. So one element that's very important for this to all work in Maine is to make sure that limits on the ability to make low-cost public sector infrastructure available aren't sneaking into bills. And there are all kinds of ways that they can sneak in, requirements to have a series of information disclosures, for example, that reveal to the private actors what the public guy is just about to do. So they swoop in and operate with some predatory pricing to make sure that the public network can't get off the ground, or holding referenda that try to get gamed by the telecom industry, although we've seen in Colorado and other places that people will vote for networks all the same. But trying to minimize the amount, just the number of hoops and the number of shenanigans that get associated with building this infrastructure is really important. And that's why you need those somewhat grizzled gallows humor people working on this set of issues, so that they will never be dismayed and they will see around the corners and understand that what might look like a reasonable limitation aimed at creating some kind of fabulistic level playing field is actually designed to cripple the public authority. Chattanooga is a good example. There are a bunch of other, there are actually now about 1,000 American cities working on fiber projects. One great ingredient is to have a university involved in the planning that can serve as a neutral convener of everybody, to make sure that all stakeholders have a voice, but nobody captures the whole thing. And I've seen that across the country, and it's a very useful ingredient. And then again, leadership is always at the heart of these things.
Susan, we have a couple questions left, and we're nearing the end of this hour. It's gone so fast. One question that came from our crowdsourcing of questions earlier was, why are municipally owned networks, and you've talked about a couple just a moment ago, Wilson, Chattanooga, why are municipally owned networks important and desirable, especially in regard to federal funding and policy?
Terrific. So a unit that can operate on all of this at an effective way, and so each city may have different needs and different existing infrastructure, and having the municipality able to plan for its own destiny and be a vessel for federal funds makes a ton of sense. It is, however, a second best alternative in my mind to what Senator Bennett was talking about. That is a state level planning effort that thinks about the whole state in a really sensible way. And the reason we've ended up with so many municipal authorities in the United States is because the states have not been involved and the federal government has not been involved. So cities, just as with electricity in the 30s, it has been cities and cooperatives that have been taking the lead. because scale is so vital to the efficient pricing of these networks, it actually makes sense for an entire region, a metro region, to work together, not a single city. As it does with transit, as it does with housing, as it does with planning for climate. All of these issues are better dealt with at a regional level than each individual city. But it's so hard for cities often to cooperate with each other because they all have their individual budgets and ways of looking at the world, that often doesn't happen. But so we've got municipal entities working on this because they're the level that's been interested right now. I am hoping that many more regional and state level efforts will get traction and be central to our planning in the country.
So these are not municipal networks there, but the regional networks, is there a name for that? I mean, I think of consumer ownership just because it's where I come from, but is there a name for those regional authorities?
Oh, well, there's some great examples of regional governments across the country.
Mm-hmm.
Portland, Oregon has a terrific one. They're rare, but they do exist. I'm thinking of, I think the word regional, communications authority is a good one. It has to be pretty tightly coordinated with transit and housing. And that, I keep learning this over and over again. You don't do communications by itself. You think about affordable housing, you think about transit, and you think about climate, all of that, and plan for a 21st century thriving life that has all of these elements. And you and all of those things are better done at a scale where the costs aren't burdening a single city. Great.
And next question is from Representative Jan Dodge, and Representative Dodge asks, how do we prepare to make sure that there are companies, trained workers, and necessary supplies to do the physical construction, since this will be happening in so many places, such a scale and such a velocity?
Yeah, and another shenanigan, frankly, that I saw in Philadelphia was the local cable monopoly hiring all of the installers and telling the installers that if they went to work for the upstart, they would no longer work for the monopoly, right? That kind of stuff can happen. And I know you can't believe this industry. It's really something. Yes, this is another great opportunity. This is like the Depression era sense that we can train people to, come out of community college with a certificate in network installation and network design. And these issues really intersect. The larger question for the state is, how do we make sure our whole populace is trained for 21st century jobs? If one of the things we're going to be doing is making sure there's great connectivity everywhere, that's one of our job categories. And involving, especially the community college level, involving creating new certificate programs quickly, getting them off the ground, sort of a civilian conservation corps focused on fiber would be really great. And these are terrific jobs. I mean, you'd want these jobs. And 80% of the cost of any fiber network is the labor involved in putting it in. So it's another great, never waste a good crisis, great opportunity.
Representative Dodge is an educator. It may not surprise you to know that. So.
Good.
I don't see other questions, but there was another one that in our crowdsourcing of questions, which I'll end with. Sometimes when we talk about the need or the desire to build in perhaps downtown areas, sometimes areas that don't have they have access, but maybe not affordable access. There's an objection that we've heard as policymakers that is overbuilding, and we should not overbuild the existing networks. Can you speak to that a little bit? What does overbuilding mean?
It's such a funny word. It just means that the incumbent is trying to avoid competition. They don't want anybody competing with them. So Singapore faced this. They had an existing cable network, and actually Stockholm did too, and a teleco. And they said, well, this doesn't make any sense. We want to have a great dark fiber network and then have a lot of private competition on top of it. And so you could call it overbuilding, or you could just call it competing or making competition possible, in other words. So the city-state of Singapore is not competing directly against the incumbent providers. It has made competition possible by, and here's another cool thing about all this, ripping up the streets just once to put in the conduit and dark fiber connecting every home and business. And then you never need to rip up the streets again. And if you're a neat person, you would like this. You just swap out the electronics and keep the glass in place. So you could call it overbuilding, which sounds slightly menacing, or you could just call it making competition possible.
Great. Well, Susan, thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Senator Bennett to wrap it up.
Thank you.
My Lord, that was a lot, and I wish that we could just bottle you up and I could just carry you around for like the next several weeks as we finish our legislation to turn to you for on-the-spot advice. So I'm going to have to rewatch this again. So happy it's recorded, and I know that word will get out, and there'll be dozens more legislators here in Maine that will be watching this at times that are more congenial to them. So again, thank you, Susan, so much for sharing. It was really magnificent. I just wanted to say, first of all, to thank you to all of our regular attendees at this caucus. As Seth said, this may be our last one. I suspect we might have some emergency gatherings in order to talk about things as they hit the floor, but I think this might be our final organized session. And I just want to say what a joy it's been to be a co-chair with Tom and Chloe and Seth and all of you, for many of you participating in many of these sessions and watching before. It's just been great. And I really want to thank Andrew and Tracy and Jeff for helping us organize the Maine Broadband Coalition. Supporting us has been terrific. So just wanted to shout that out. And I also wanted to, I guess this is a little embarrassing. I have to tell you about an event that I'm speaking at.
Oh, no, let me do that. Let me do that.
Okay, all right, good. I'll let you do that. Good. But and the out on that is if you show up late, you get to miss me. But anyway, I just want to say thank you to all of you, and it's been a joy.
I get to sing the praise of the good senator, our good Senate co-chair. He will be appearing on June 4th, which is next Friday, at the Maine West Broadband Summit. The Maine West Broadband Summit. Maine West has been doing a fantastic job organizing in Western Maine around broadband and moving our state forward from that region. Senator Bennett will be speaking, I think, at 9. Is that right, Senator? Ish? You're muted. Oh, you're still muted.
I know, it's terrible. It's from 8:30 to 10. So if you show up at around 8:45, you get to miss me.
Got it. I'll be there at 8:30. And it'll be a great day. I encourage people, if they're available, to participate in that. And then please do make sure, information is posted in the chat. You can sign up. And please stay tuned. We'll get the word out to everybody about the big Maine Broadband Coalition Summit in the fall, where Susan will be the keynote. Really excited about that as well. We'll be able to continue to hear from and hopefully correspond with Susan. So again, Susan, thank you so much. It was a fabulous session. And everybody that doesn't already have this book, send me a note. We'll get you one.
Thank you so much, Seth. Thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Great. Take care, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.